Hi, so today we are going to look at snare, and I'm going to show you how I take a snare which starts as it was recorded. It's sounding dull, not a lot of tone in it, not cutting through the mix at all, sounds distant and muffled, really hard to hear the details. And I'm going to show you how I take that from that place to something that sounds really high-end, really nicely produced and record ready. And I hope you're going to find that interesting and useful. But before we get started, if you can subscribe and hit the like, and if you can press the thanks button, that really helps the channel keep going and is really appreciated. And let's have a look. Okay, so I am going to show you how I took a snare which sounds from... Okay, so we're going to look at how I took a snare from this to this. So you can hear huge difference. The first one was just the raw recording. The faders, I haven't changed the level of any of the faders. There might be some slight differences in volume, but the balances are the same. What we're listening to there is the top and bottom snare mic and the overheads. And you can hear that when we start with the raw recording, the snare is really a long way from where it needs to be. And when we listen to the processed version, it sounds record ready, ready to highly produced, really high-end sounding drums. So a quick listen again to it without, and then we're going to look at what I did. So starting with it without. So it sounds dull. You can't hear a lot of tone. There's not a lot of transient. It's not going to cut through in the mix at all. That's going to get lost in the mix. You're not going to hear the details, and it's not going to cut through. Especially, this is a jazz track, and it gets pretty full on in places, and that snare just gets completely swallowed up. And if you turn it up more, then you end up hearing other things poking through too loudly. And it just does not sit at all in the mix. So we need it to sit nicely in the mix. It needs to create a space for itself so that you can hear it. It needs a nice transient attack without sounding kind of artificially too squeezed or anything. And we need to bring the tone out. So you get a nice tone. We need to bring a bit of the low end. So it needs a nice top and nice low end. We need to bring out just the tone of the snare itself. And finally, we need to be able to hear the details. Now, the overheads are inextricably linked to the snare, obviously because you're hearing a lot of the snare through the overheads. Now, there's a double problem here, and I'm not going to go into the details in this video of how I dealt with this, but the double problem is that as well as the snare not sounding anything like we need it to sound, the overheads also don't sound right. So the cymbals are just being kind of hit in kind of a splashy way in this section, and it's not as apparent what the problem is. But as soon as he starts playing on a ride cymbal, playing a ride pattern, you just can't hear the details of what he's doing at all. And that's because they used ribbons on these overheads. And yeah, there's ribbons and there's ribbons. There are ribbons that can pick up that kind of detail, and there are ribbons that are absolutely not the best choice for trying to pick up detailed ride work. So I would tend to go with small diaphragm condensers for that. And I have heard ribbons that can do it, but a lot of ribbons, just like the ones used here, you're not going to get the detail you need on those intricate ride patterns, especially once it's up in the mix. But there are ways to fix that, and I'll look at that in another video. But the processing I did to make that happen is also going to play into the sound of the snare, because of course it's going to be affecting the snare because the snare is coming through those overheads. And the way this was recorded, the snare is coming a lot through the overheads, which is fine. But it does mean that since I need to do quite a bit to them, it's going to change the snare sound. So it's a balancing act in a situation like that. And sometimes in jazz, you have the cymbals are mic'd closer. And so you have less, you get snare through there, but not as much. Other times they're mic'd higher like they were here. At least that's what it sounds like to me. I wasn't at the session, and then you get a significant amount of snare through there. And that's what we have here. And that's fine. There's nothing at all wrong with doing that. But it does mean that that processing is going to play even more strongly into what happens with the snare. So first thing we're going to do is EQ the snare. So I'm using this. It's an SSLG. I really like using SSLs. As anybody knows who's watched my videos before with drums, I love SSLs on drums just because I know these desks and I know how they sound, and it's just so easy for me to dial in what I need, and they just sound great on drums. Certainly there's plenty of other EQs and desks that sound great on drums, but I just find it very quick and easy to get where I need to with these, so I tend to use an SSL. And the G series and E series do sound quite different from each other to my ears, and so does the J. And to me, I felt I wanted something not quite as aggressive as an E, which is why I chose the G for this. Now let's have a look at what I've done. I have boosted around 3K to bring out some top end. I've pulled out a bit here, which is around, where is that? Looks like it's about, 560 hertz. With a slightly tighter cue, there was just a boxiness here that I needed to pull out. And then I boosted here at 320 hertz. And this gave me the basic thing I needed. Plus I high passed it here, because there was some kick drum coming through that was not necessarily adding anything to the kick drum. I mean, one thing that's worth considering is if you've got kick drum coming through all your other mics quite loudly, especially if you've got low frequencies coming through, you could well have a phase issue there when you add that into the kick drum. And you could, spoil your kick drum sound. So I tend to, if there's a lot of kick drum spill, I tend to pull back on those low frequencies just because I don't want to have to worry about, messing with the phase when I'm trying to get the kick drum sound based on the snare, and change the snare volume and suddenly my kick drum sound changes. I don't want that. So in this case, that was the situation. But I also found that by pulling up here, and this is a nice little trick, is that when you do a high pass with a boost, you kind of chase the low end you boosted up with a high pass, and you get a nice tightening of that low end. So it tends to give that low end a bit of a tighter, punchier sound, which is what I've done here as well. Okay, no compression here. I use another compressor. So let's have a listen to this before and after. I'll start with it out and then I'll bring it in. Now you'll notice right away that it's got more punch and attack just from EQing it. I mean, it's partly the SSL has that kind of a punchy, attacky sound to it, but it's really not so much that, it's just the EQ moves I've done. I found the top end bit I wanted, where the real attack was. And then by pulling out this bit of EQ here, I pulled out some boxiness, but what that did is it revealed the tone of the snare. Because one of the things that you get with any sound is you can get masking within the sound itself. So you get some resonances on some frequencies that actually mask the sound of other frequencies. And oftentimes you find a cut is better than a boost because it reveals something that was otherwise obscured and covered up. And that's exactly what's happened here. If you listen to the kind of tone and the ring, the nice ring of the snare, it's easier to hear with this in than without. And then The low end here is, I just found that fundamental frequency of the snare, that kind of low end punchy sound, and that's what I pushed up a bit. So again, we listen to it before and then afterwards. So already it's gone a long way. Now next, I wanted to use a compressor. So I used this, which is a pretty classic kind of compressor to use on a snare, 1176 blackface. But I actually don't use this compressor that often on snare. I've got other ones I tend to go to first, but I actually found that this did exactly what I needed it to do. I tried my usual go-tos and I wasn't quite getting there, and this one just got me there. So let's listen to this before and afterwards. So to me, it's just holding that snare together, the sound of it together. It is taming it a bit, but I think you'll hear that is not going to be a problem once I put in the overhead processing. And of course, I did this in context of the overhead processing, so which I haven't put in yet. And what I found was, and I'll do an A/B of this when I've got the overhead processing in, there was more than enough kind of excitement to the snare already, and there too much, this is why I wanted to just hold it together a little bit here. So you'll hear what I mean when I bring in the overhead. And this is what I'm going to do now, is bring in the overhead processing. And I'm going to show you what I've done with that. So I'll bring it in. I'll start with it out, and then I'm going to bring it in. So you can hear a lot more top end and excitement comes out of those overheads. And again, that's something that I wouldn't, that's something I had to work with, because I needed that in order to get those ribbon mics, which are very dull sounding, to bring out the detail. And this part of the track, he's not doing any intricate ride patterns, but as soon as you hit those ride patterns, you couldn't hear what he was doing. So I needed to bring that out, and that, as I said before, that strongly affected the snare. So everything I did to the snare channel itself had to be in the context of this. So now I'm going to bring it in and out this compressor here in the context, and you can hear what it's like. Start with it out and then bring it in. So it's fairly subtle, but it just holds it in, it contains it a little bit, and it stops it from jumping. And I found that it was kind of jumping out a little bit, especially in the context of the mix. And this did a nice kind of job of that. So again, I'm not crushing the life out of it or anything like that with this 1176. It's a fairly subtle move, but it gave it that slightly smoother produced sound, which I felt the track needed. So now let's have a look at what I've done with the overheads. So starting with here, high pass, massive high pass here. Now this is optional, and I think it sounds quite good without this. In the end, I used the high pass because in the context of the rest of the mix, it was a little muddy down there. And, you know, there's some kick drum coming through here and over these overheads, and it just was not adding. It sounded better with it in than out in the context of the mix on its own. I think it sounds good without the high pass. So let's hear it without, and then I'll bring it in and out here. But we're concentrating on the snare, so just think about the sound of the snare with and without. Start without. I think it sounds good both ways. It's got a little bit more low end with the high pass out, but with it in some ways, you hear those upper bass frequencies, those upper mids a little bit more. Yeah, but it's subtle, and I just felt that in the context of the mix, it sounded better with this in. Okay, so just having a listen to other things other than the snare, have a listen to this with, you know, thinking about the low end here and the kick drum. See, there's a lot more low end coming through there. And that was also clouding things up a bit. And I didn't feel it added enough. You know, yes, you get a little bit more lows in the snare, but the lows you were getting on the kick drum I felt was kind of taking away a bit from the kick drum sound, clouding it up a little bit around the bass area. And particularly because the bass instrument on here, an acoustic bass, had a lot of low end going on in it. And this was, you weren't hearing any of that low end, completely covered up with the bass. But what you were doing is just hearing a little bit of kind of extra mud, and it needed clearing out. So that's that. Now, I added some other EQs, which I won't go over in this video. In fact, I added a whole bunch of other EQs in here and some saturation, but I'll say that for another video. The one that's relevant here is this split EQ, where you see this huge boost I've done here at 2.6K. This is where the ride cymbal hits are. And on this particular recording, they're usually in that area-ish. And in this particular recording, with these particular mics, this is what was missing, what needed bringing up. So if you're unfamiliar with split EQ, this is an amazing plugin. I've done a video on it. It really is, I've gotten so completely dependent on this thing now, as many other mix engineers have, because it is something that gives you so much control that's never been possible before, never possible in the hardware world. And it's one of these things where digital really comes into its own. And what you can do is you can EQ the transient portion and the sustained portion of the sound separately. So if you need to bring up the non-transient bit, the sustained part of a sound without affecting the transient, because if you just EQ'd the whole thing, the transient would be way too in your face. You can just EQ the sustained part, and in this case, the opposite is also true. You can just EQ the transient, and this is what I needed to do here. I needed to bring up just those transients. If I'd brought the whole EQ up this much, if you can imagine, it would have killed it completely. It would have just sounded way too brash and, massively over EQ'd. And I'd never do that. But in this case, that amount of transient, it's only on those very short transients that this EQ takes effect. And it was just enough to bring out those hits, which were almost, to be honest, inaudible with those ribbon mics, and were completely inaudible in the context of the mix. And with this, I was actually able to bring them out, and they sounded quite natural and nice sounding. But of course, it affects the snare and brings out the transient of the snare too. And that's why I've set up the original snare channel the way I did, because I was hearing it with the context of this. Okay, now, Maybe I wouldn't have brought out the snare transient that much if I didn't need to bring out the cymbals. I probably wouldn't have done. I think it still sounds good, but I probably wouldn't have brought as much out as I did. But it wasn't necessary. It's one of those compromises that you need to make when you don't have an ideal sounding recording from the start. So I'm going to bring this in and out just to hear what it's like. Start with it out. So, I mean, it sounds good both ways. I mean, I might have done a tiny bit of this. But in the context of the mix, again, it sounds good. And I'm going to play now in the context of the mix so you can hear what it's like. And I'll bring out the processing and bring it back in as well, just so you can hear what it's like. Now without the processing in. Get them back in again here. So you can hear a huge difference. Without the processing, it sounded completely dull and hard to hear the details. If you look at the meters, I mean, the levels are the same either way, because I have gain matched it. It doesn't sound like it, does it? It sounds quite a bit louder with the processing in, but at least by the meters, it's definitely not. But you can just hear, you know, regardless of that, whether it's louder or not, you can hear the detail so much better. You can hear even the splashy cymbals are easier to hear. And you can hear the tone of the snare, and it sounds much more release ready, and like a more high-end recording. So I hope you found this useful. If you did, give the video a like and ring the bell and press the thanks button. That really helps the channel keep going, and hope to see you next time.